Well, Gabby, thank you, and thank you all for the opportunity to come here and be among friends, to reunite with old colleagues, and frankly, to take part in a very important discussion. I've been asked to come here and talk about national security in the cyber domain, and that's a large topic. So forgive me if I narrow it a bit, and maybe chat with you a bit about current American thinking on this subject, and then perhaps enliven that narrative with a few of my own personal experiences. As Gabi points out, the head of CIA and NSA, I've been able to be present at the point in time when some national decisions were made. And let me express to you very clearly at the beginning what I think the totality of my remarks are going to suggest. That even in a country like my own, which has a wonderful IT and computing industry, which has the world's largest signals intelligence agency in the form of the National Security Agency, which has created the first large functioning command for operations in the cyber domain, even in my country, with all those relevant facts, my government is very late to need. My government is not nearly as powerful protecting me in the cyber domain as I expect my government to be to protecting me in the physical domain. Now, there are lots of reasons for that, but that reality drives me to the conclusion that no matter how much we improve what my government or your government does, no matter how much we decide on clear policy and law, so governments have clear direction, that for as far as my eyes can see, you, the private sector, are going to have a more dominant, more prominent, more necessary role in providing security in this cyberspace than we ever think of the private sector protecting us in the physical space of land, sea, and air. In other words, with government late to need, private entrepreneurs are and must step forward to provide levels of defense. So that's what I will repeat at the end, but I think that's the fundamental point of what it is I want to share with you today. But let me begin. Let me begin at my beginning, because I first encountered this cyber thing in the mid-1990s. I had actually, prior to that, been the chief of intelligence for American forces in Europe. And if you remember the history of the 1990s, particularly the early 1990s, my day was consumed with fighting in the Balkans, with Bosnia and Croatia, and later Kosovo. I can recall one instance where I went to visit Pristina in Kosovo, and I was, as an American, I was being briefed by the NATO intelligence group there, and my briefer was a British officer, and he was giving us that basic familiarization tour of, Kosovo is so large, and it has so many people, and its largest city is Pristina, very basic stuff. And at that point, your mind kind of just not paying close attention. But I still recall the British officer saying, now, I know you have flown from the East Coast of the United States, so I want to give you a sense of time. For example, when it's 12 o'clock in New York, it's 1389 here in Kosovo. Okay. And there I was, in more than 3 years, dealing with the immediate after effects of the Battle of Kosovo Polje in the 14th century. And I was pulled out of that tour and moved to San Antonio, Texas. And I was given command of the Air Intelligence Agency. And at that point, I had gone from dealing with the most medieval of problems to the most modern. And blessedly, I had a wonderful staff in Texas. They knew this cyber thing. And frankly, American Air Force thinking at this time was fairly advanced. when it came to cyber. If you recall, only a few years before we had fought the first Gulf War, after the invasion of Kuwait. And in American military thinking, we considered that to be the first information war. If you recall our tactics there, okay, we had used precision bombardment. We had used precision strike. The Air Force, my Air Force, yours as a matter of fact as well, have given up mass in the traditional sense and traded mass in for precision. So we now achieve battlefield effects with very precise weapons that in the past required large numbers of weapons and large numbers of airframes. Well, precision is no more good than the intelligence which tells you where to precisely put the weapon. And so, again, America's Air Force was very much into information dominance, information superiority, and so on. So it was a small step in the mid-90s to move its thinking from just information to cyber. And the most important doctrinal point I learned in that first year or two was that, and this is obvious, I think, to everyone in the room, but it was not obvious then, and I want to emphasize it as a point here, that we viewed cyber to be a domain. We viewed cyber as a place where the American military would ensure American freedom of action while holding in reserve the ability to deny freedom of action to anyone else. Any of you familiar with air power can see echoes of air power theory. I mean, that's like air superiority. You know, we will use the air for our purposes, and we will deny the use of the air for others' purposes. A domain, you know, land, sea, air, space, cyber. By the way, what I just did to you, that little counting on the fingers, 3 summers ago, I was in Las Vegas. And I was having this conversation with Black Hat, the semi-reformed hackers who gather in Las Vegas every summer. And it was a far less intimate group. I mean, I can see all of you, right? This was at the ballroom at Caesar's Palace. And there were 3,000 out there in the darkness, and me, the former director of the National Security Agency, up there in front, and I kind of leaned forward out of the lights into the darkness and went, land, sea, air, space, cyber. And I could kind of see the folks kind of nodding. And then I said, because that made them feel good, you know, the little thumb here was theirs. And I said, but God made land, sea, air, and space. You guys made cyber, and you messed it up. I'll come to how they messed it up in a minute. But I have to tell you, when you tell an American military officer, frankly, I think when you tell any military officer that cyber is a domain, it is a curiously liberating thought. I mean, if you don't think of it as a domain, you have to think of it as a network or as bandwidth or all those other really technical problems which are hard for us to figure out. But when you think of it as a domain, you say, well, like the other domains, it's got to have its own characteristics. This one, inherently global, inherently strategic, characterized by great maneuverability, characterized by great speed. And in this particular domain, because of the way those people at Black Hat created it, remember I said they messed it up? In this particular domain, practically all advantage went to the offense. This domain was not designed to slow things down. It was designed to speed things up. I'll be very efficient about this because I know Gabi wants us to stay on time. But when I talk to large audiences, I try to and by the way, I'm not a technologist. I'm a liberal arts major, so I try to think of things in terms of geography or history. So when I talk about this domain where all advantage goes to the offense, what I usually tell audiences, I had 2 tours in Korea. Okay, practically all American military officers are going to spend time in Korea. And we spent all of our time on a war plan there called 5027. And the title of the war plan is Defense of the Korean Peninsula. And so every 2 years, we kind of rethink how we're going to defend South Korea. And geography matters. If I had a map of Korea up here, I would show you there are only 3 ways you can get from the north to the south. You can come down the road along the east coast, okay, on the east coast of the peninsula. But the distance between the mountains and the sea along the east coast is in many cases greater than the width of this room. There is no successful invasion going to come down that east coast road. So then you come over here to the other side of the peninsula. Well, how can they come south? And over here, they can come down something called the Kaesong-Munsan corridor, which is actually the floodplain of the Han and the Imjin rivers. It was the invasion route in 1950. You got to get over some water, so you got to bring some bridging equipment. I'm seeing some folks nod here, so I think I've got some engineers in the room. Armor can move. But you know, about 20 kilometers south of the demilitarized zone in that part of Korea, we have constructed the largest tank trap in the world. It's on all your maps. And in order to keep it slightly hidden from the North Koreans, we don't call it the largest tank trap in the world. We call it Seoul, okay? A city of 14 million people. Okay? No armor is going to get through Seoul and survive. So that's not the way they're coming. The third route is a valley in the middle of the country. It's called the Chorwan. It starts in the north, it ends in the south, and it empties out south of the Seoul megalopolis. Oh, that feels bad. But God, remember, God being better than those other guys? God made the valley wide in the north and narrow in the south. They come down that valley, they're all going to die in their tanks. Sorry, long segue. The people who made the internet didn't build any Chorwan valleys. There are no natural defense positions. All advantage goes to the offense. And that's why we're here. That's why this is such a dangerous place. Now, back to American military thought. Let me take this concept of a domain in 1997 and end up with Cyber Command at Fort Meade in 2009. Once we Americans start thinking about a domain, we start to think, well, you know, if it's a domain, you could actually conduct operations there. And if it's a domain, I'm creative enough to think of circumstances in which the operations there are decisive. Look at the others. Land. Gettysburg, the major battle in my history. Purely a land battle, decisive. Trafalgar, purely a sea battle, decisive. Battle of Britain, purely an air battle. But it decided whether or not there would be an invasion of the British Isles. And so we began to think that, well, you know, if it's a domain, you may be able to create decisive effects in that domain. And then the necessary corollary is what happens in the other domains might be supportive or secondary. Normandy. Naval bombardment at Normandy. Very useful, but supportive. The decisive fight was the invasion force. Western Pacific, World War II. General MacArthur. Island hopping. Island hopping using ground and sea forces to do what? To get runways. in order to enable air power. And so, I mean, once we Americans said this was a domain, man, we really said, boy, this cyber thing could really take off, and that we could be decisive in the cyber domain, and then everything else could be merely supportive. Okay? We could create decisive effects. Well, again, I'm reflecting Americans here now, but frankly, I think other nations, yours in particular, will likely follow this logic. Once you think it's a domain, once you think you can have decisive effects there, once you think that your other forces could be merely supportive rather than decisive, I mean, that's almost inexorable logic that, okay, then I need a command. Then I need forces. I need to organize to fight in the cyber domain. And so in 2009, with this kind of, as I said, inexorable logic, in 2009, we create Cyber Command, and I'm reading here from the charter, charged with the conduct of full spectrum military cyber operations. Full spectrum. Now, I almost talked about full spectrum, and there'll be follow-on seminars dealing with other aspects, but you get the point. This command at Fort Meade is going to do in the cyber domain what we Americans expect our Air Force to do in the air domain, which the real shorthand is anything we want. Okay, that we would control that space for our own security needs. I should point out that although Cyber Command is a big deal, okay, and the fact that we organized it and we were first should be very revealing to most folks. There were predecessor organizations, and I will be very brief because I do not want to pull you through the alphabet soup of American military organizations. But 10 years before Cyber Command, we had something called the Information Operations Technology Center. Okay. Where was it? Fort Meade, Maryland, at NSA, the same place as Cyber Command. Who was the director? And then after the IOTC, the Information Operations Technology Center, we formed something else. Joint Functional Component Command Net Warfare. And who was the commander of that? Okay. I still recall the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time was Dick Meyer, Air Force officer. And General Meyer invited me, chairman, General Meyer invited me, director of NSA, and Jim Cartwright, four-star general, commander of STRATCOM at the time, later our vice chairman and a very innovative cyber thinker, invited me down to the chairman's office and said, all right, so you want this new thing, kind of a joint task force for cyber, Joint Functional Component Command Net Warfare. He said, and he says, he looks me right in the eye. He says, Mike, I know him from way back. General Myers, the chairman, looks me in the eye and says, Mike, all right, this looks like a big deal. I'll give you my approval, but is this going to fix this? I mean, are we going to be okay with Cyber Command, or with this Joint Functional Command? And I looked General Myers in the eye and told him completely honestly, oh, no, sir, not at all. But in 2 years, we're going to come back with another idea because we're going to be messing this up at a much higher level than we are now. Do you get the point? I mean, this was an evolution. And now we are at Cyber Command. I mean, I'm sorry to repeat myself, but to think we Americans have a combatant command dedicated to operations in the cyber domain. That's a big deal, and not trivial. I mean, and not something that doesn't carry a lot of meaning. Let me go further. At about the same time Cyber Command was created, an article appeared in Foreign Affairs magazine. Foreign Affairs is our best magazine for these kinds of works. It was written by Bill Lynn, the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And it laid out American defense thinking DOD's thinking on this cyber domain. Let me throw a few words out here, okay? Emphasize, first of all, I spent a lot of time saying this is a real dangerous place. Kind of my Korea example, there are no boundaries. All advantage goes to the offense. But he spends a whole bunch of time. By the way, he actually told some things that have been previously secret in the article about how American military networks have been attacked. So he kind of laid that out. And then he began to use words like active defense, which he doesn't quite define in the article intentionally. Okay? And here's a great quote. He outlines the role of the new command as part sensor, part sentry, part sharpshooter. Okay? Part sensor, part sentry, part sharpshooter. I think that besides being nicely alliterative and sounding almost poetic, I think it's also fairly revealing as to the breadth of American thought as to what we would intend to do in the cyber domain. I got one more thing I gotta emphasize for you too. The most important line in the article, bar none, without question, the most important line was the one right under the title. The one that's said by William J. Lynn III, Deputy Secretary of Defense. The most seminal intellectual piece on American cyber thinking was written by the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Not by the Attorney General, not by the Deputy Secretary of Commerce, not by the Deputy Secretary of State. It was written by the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And what happened domestically for us was that defense had gone out ahead of everyone else, kind of staked out its turf, kind of defining the cyber domain through the lens of American military thinking. And this article was barely circulated to the rest of government before it was published. It was, I think you can tell, it's perfectly in line with American military thought. But it also now has become a significant portion of American thought because defense was so far out in front of everyone else. Now, as you might imagine, I'm sure it happens here, it sure does happen back at home, there was almost immediate pushback. The Department of Homeland Security, which actually has the legal responsibility to protect our critical infrastructure, began to push back against DOD's wide definition. A couple of months after Bill Lynn's article came out, Jane Hall-Lute, Jane is the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security. She's Janet Napolitano's deputy. Jane came out with a piece a few months later. She was a co-author. And now, remember the quotes from Bill Lynn, right? Now, this is also a senior American government official and a prominent publication. Quote, cyberspace is not a war zone. And then she adds, quote, cyberspace is a place where geography matters differently. And the role of nation states in its security is an open question. Compare the language. The role of the nation state in cybersecurity is an open question. Active defense, sensor, sentry, sharpshooter. And you might figure out that we've got some big questions to answer inside the American government. There are some issues here as to what this means. By the way, State Department jumped in too. They had their own views. If I say The Onion, is that a familiar? I see some idea. The Onion is a satirical magazine back home. All right. Okay. Yeah. It's really quite outlandish. A couple of months after we had these dueling articles, I came across a 2-page white paper. And it was from the White House telling Americans how to talk about the cyber domain publicly. And it was trying to square the Jane Hall-Lute article with the Bill Lynn article. Okay? And the language was so convoluted that when somebody first gave me the two-page white paper, I actually thought it was from The Onion, okay? I actually thought it was from this satirical piece. So, apropos our discussion here, and I've got a few more points to make internationally, but apropos our discussion here, domestically, in the United States, despite the incredible cyber firepower we have created, and I'm fond of saying, and it's probably a bit chauvinistic on my part, but that the greatest concentration of cyber power in the universe is at the intersection of the Baltimore-Washington Parkway and Maryland Route 32. And anybody who's been in the neighborhood knows that's Fort Meade, Maryland. That's where NSA is, that's where Cyber Command is. Despite that, we Americans have not yet decided what it is we want our government to do to defend us in the cyber domain, nor have we decided what it is we will let our government do to defend us in the cyber domain. And so I see tremendous energy right now in my second life with the Chertoff Group and so on, in the American private sector, because so much of our government talent is still on the sidelines and has never gotten into the game because of these serious policy and legal questions. Now, if this cyber thing causes ripples for us domestically, you've got to see these ripples internationally as well. So let me spend a few minutes talking about how what it is we've done has created disturbances in the international domain. Within a few months of Cyber Command being created, okay, so this is summer 2009, McAfee commissioned a study globally of about 600 IT and security professionals. And in the questionnaire, they asked these professionals, which country do you fear the most when it comes to dangers in the cyber domain? Now, I know the answer to that question in the United States. Okay? I won't pretend to know the answer here in Israel. But globally, 600 IT professionals, when asked in 2009, a few months after the formation of Cyber Command, who do you fear most in cyberspace? The answer was the United States of America. Now, as the former director of the National Security Agency, it's not clear if the questionnaire and the formation of the command are really tight, you know, whether that was cause and effect. It's not clear whether if you would ask them today, if they would say the same thing. But it is clear in 2009, my country beat out China and Russia as most feared in the cyber domain. There was obviously suspicion. I mean, part of the suspicion comes from the fact that Cyber Command comes out of what community inside the United States? It comes out of NSA. You know, Cyber Command's at NSA. That task force I commanded was at NSA. That technology center I directed was at NSA. I mean, it just comes out of this air of espionage. And therefore, cyber, it really does back home, and I think it's elsewhere, including in Israel. It carries this kind of both aura and burden for having come out of the espionage world. Let me give you a further complication, and this is more technical, and it's I think, very important. Remember I did land, sea, airspace? Okay. We've built up our habits in here. Right? We've built up our habits of thinking about combat in the domains in which we have experience. Land, sea, and air, largely. Okay. In those domains, reconnaissance, the intel thing, reconnaissance is what you do before you do the attack, right? I mean, you've got to know where the target is before you go out and apply heat or blast or fragmentation to the target. So reconnaissance comes first, and then you have the attack. For those of you who follow the American military staff system, the J2's work, the intel guy's work, comes first, and then the J3, the operator, comes in. You still have to do reconnaissance in cyber first too. You need to know the target. But in the physical domain, the recce, the reconnaissance, is almost always easier than the attack. It's infinitely easier to know where the enemy is than it is to go and defeat the enemy. In a strange but very important way, in the cyber domain, although the reconnaissance comes first, it is the more difficult task. It is more difficult to invade, be present on, extract information from, and remain undetected on an adversary network than it is to actually attack it and create destructive effects. Put another way, the attack in the cyber domain is a lesser included case of the reconnaissance. If you can penetrate and live on a network, you own it already. And so in this new domain, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to distinguish the intentions of an adversary once an adversary has penetrated your network. Because although he may only be there for espionage purposes, he already has the full capacity to create destructive effects inside your network. That's what makes it very difficult globally for all of us to decide what actually constitutes cyber aggression. Okay? What rules really do apply? Look, back home, most Americans think that if something unpleasant happens to them on the internet, they've been attacked. And we just use the word attack to describe just about everything. But frankly, and I think as Amos suggested, right now, most of the nasty things happening on the internet, he and I, given our background, would call espionage. Okay? And I think you know this, espionage is an accepted international practice. Okay? It's not an act of war. All adult nations do it. Okay? You don't see it in the PG movies, but you do see it in the R-rated movies. They're all there. Everyone does it. Now, I will admit, cyber domain, remember, no Korea, no valleys, no hills, all advantage to the offense. The scale of theft in the cyber domain is so large, and the kinds of things being stolen, not state secrets, but your stuff, your intellectual property, okay, your competitive advantage, that might be so different that over time we may want to rethink what's an accepted international practice. But right now, espionage is what everyone does, and it's generally accepted. It's generally accepted. Now, there are other things going bump out there in the cyber domain. If I tell this audience, Estonia 2007, Georgia 2008, you all kind of nod. Distributed denial of service attacks. One, because the Estonians are tearing down a memorial to the Red Army in Tallinn. One, because 2 Russian divisions are invading Georgia. In both cases, patriotic Russian hackers attacked the internet system of Estonia and the internet system of Georgia and bring it to its knees. Casus belli? I don't know. NATO did not believe it triggered an Article 5 issue in Estonia. And Estonia, by the way, did not claim it triggered an Article 5 issue. Article 5 is the triggering of self-defense. An attack against one is an attack against all. But I think you can imagine, I can imagine, attacks of that nature so destructive that we might think they break the threshold of a casus belli. And by the way, since much of those attacks flowed through servers not in Russia, but in third countries, what right did the targeted countries have to shoot back? Or at least what right did Estonia or Georgia, had they had the capacity, what right did Estonia or Georgia have to pursue the attacker through a World Wide Web? Does a file on a server in, say, Houston or Bonn, does that enjoy the same kind of sovereignty that the building or the neighborhood in which it's located enjoys sovereignty? I don't know. Remember land, sea, air, space, right? Okay. This is Israel, right? This Israel? Yeah. How far up do I have to go before it's not Israel? That is not the accepted international practice. Do you see the point? At some point, it's not Israel. At some altitude. I don't know what it is. I don't know what the legal definition is. Well, is there something like that in the cyber domain that creates different thinking about absolute sovereignty? I don't know. And by the way, I'm not going to talk about it, but if you move beyond Estonia and Georgia, 2007, 2008, and fast forward to Iran in 2011, we're not now talking about someone taking down someone's internet system. We're talking about someone actually creating physically destructive effects. And so if you need anything to kind of put an exclamation point or to underline, hey, this is really important, it's really important. Okay. So let me end where I began. This is, I think, and I'm comfortable with the thought that it is a new domain. But as soon as you begin to think about it as a new domain, you know, land, sea, airspace, cyber, and to take all the lessons you've got down here, land, sea, airspace, and try to apply them to here, a whole bunch of them don't work. A whole bunch of them don't apply. And so again, I'll speak as an American, but I think Israel shares our experience. Our old institutions are not well organized for these new challenges. Our old laws are not well thought through for these new challenges. Our old habits in our political culture are not well developed for these new challenges. And I predict, no matter how great the danger becomes or how robust our governments respond, our governments will still be limited by those factors, their structures, their laws, their policies, their habits. And that then will require, not just allow, but will require the private sector to step up and to do things in this domain that we would never expect the private sector to do to make us safe in those other more physical, more traditional, more protected spaces. And with that, I thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the day providing me and you some answers to the questions that I've raised in my opening comments. Thank you.